uniting the races with truth instead of dividing them with lies. We're also rebuilding the family by rebuilding the man. I am Elie Peterson. Welcome to the Thursday edition of the Elie Peterson Show. Thank you so much for being with me. Dr. Singh is coming up in the third hour. Yes, it's Thursday already. Isn't that amazing? It is Thursday. Another full, very full show for you today, as well as your phone calls. 888-77-53773, 888-77-JESSE. I have with me Elie Mystal, and he's out of New York to discuss the Michigan State Constitution Amendment, Proposition 2, heard by the U.S. Supreme Court last week. And the law was passed by the voters of Michigan 58 to 24% in 2006, banning affirmative action based on race in public university admissions, meaning that you can't get in there anymore simply because you're black or Hispanic, but especially black because it's more of a black issue. Elie is the editor of Above the Law, a legal website providing news, insight, and opinions of law firms, lawyers, law schools, lawsuits, judges, and court. Elie has written for Above the Law for over 5 years, since 2008. He's earned a degree in government from Harvard University and a JD from Harvard Law School. So he is a smart man, and he's written editorials for the New York Daily News and the New York Times, and has appeared on both MSNBC and Fox News. Elie, good morning, sir, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Jesse. How are you this morning?
All is well, man. I appreciate you being here. What is the name of the law firm that you work with?
Oh, I used to work for. Now I make a living writing, which is much better than being a lawyer. I used to work for a firm called Debevoise and Plimpton.
Oh, okay.
Which is one of your kind of general Wall Street, hey, you have $1 billion, we'll defend you kind of firms.
Yeah. This is a very interesting subject to me, affirmative action based on color. And I've never been a fan of affirmative action based on color. I've not been a fan of affirmative action, period, but definitely not based on color, because it put a stigma on those blacks who are working hard to get into schools and jobs and things like that. It made those people look like they're there simply because they're black and not because they earned it. But Elie, let me play this news report. Let's go to clip 1A there, Andre. Play this news report. Court hears affirmative action case where the race can be a factor. Andre, what are you doing?
I'm trying to find it, sir.
You don't have it on your paper there? Look under 1A. We'll get to that in a minute, folks. And we'll get to your calls at 888-77-53773, 888-77-JESSE. Here's that report now.
And the Supreme Court hears arguments today in an affirmative action case. It is a challenge to a Michigan law that says race cannot be a factor in college admissions. The result could be felt nationwide. Jan Crawford is at the Supreme Court. Jan, good morning. So what would this mean?
Well, you know, Nora, voters in Michigan and other states across the country passed these bans on affirmative action after the Supreme Court actually refused to outlaw all racial preferences. So now what this would mean is if the court allows these kind of bans in Michigan and other states, you could see affirmative action across the country going out the door.
We're going to take a quick break. I'll come back to my guests and your phone calls right after this break. Okay, talking about affirmative action there in Michigan, the court, U.S. Supreme Court heard the case, and the decision will come down in June, I believe. 58% of the voters say no to affirmative action in Michigan for admission to universities there, university admission. I have with me Elie Mystal, and an attorney in Michigan, out of New York, I'm sorry. Elie, what do you think about this? 58% of the folks in Michigan said no to affirmative action based on color. The U.S. Supreme Court has heard the case now. We are to get an answer next June. Where do you stand on affirmative action?
Yeah, I'm generally in favor of it. I mean, I think when you look at what the voters in Michigan did, it's really quite interesting. They decided that race was the one thing that people are not allowed to consider. So people in Michigan can care about whether or not you can dunk a basketball. They can care about whether or not your father went to the school. They can care about whether or not you wore a nice suit to the interview. All of that is still on the table. But race and a person's kind of background and the totality of their history, that's the one thing that they can't look at. Now, what's really interesting here, right, is that you could have, if any individual university in the state of Michigan doesn't want to look at race, doesn't want to consider a person's background when making admissions decisions, they're free to do so. There's no law requiring universities to imply affirmative action. Universities apply affirmative action because they want to, because they believe that having a diverse class is better for all students, white, black, Hispanic, and Martian. This Michigan law says that universities who want to apply affirmative action are not allowed to do so, even though they're allowed to apply everything else. And that's what I think is unconstitutional. Not that I think the court's going to agree with me.
But back in 2003, didn't they pass a law in Michigan saying that schools had to take, people of color or take in people based on color?
No. They passed a law saying saying that if schools wanted to do that, that was okay as long as it wasn't a quota. And I think that affirmative action is applied very differently in many different states over a period of time. I think that constitutionally it's very clear, and I think I even as a supporter of affirmative action, I agree with this, that having any kind of quota system is wrong and bad and doesn't help anybody. Saying, we have to have at least 10 blacks, that doesn't help anybody. That's not the point of affirmative action, that is now illegal.
How do you feel knowing that if they allow these black people to come in based on color, that you're discriminating against whites and others based on ability? Does that bother you at all?
Yeah, see, I disagree with the premise, right? I don't think that they're allowing kids to come to school because of color.
No, they are. I know many cases like that. So it is happening.
But when you say based on ability, like what's your standard of ability, right? For a lot of people, a lot of people believe that something like the SAT, some kind of standardized test, is the end-all, be-all, the only objective measure we have of ability. But there are a lot of people like me who disagree with that. And I'm not saying the SAT isn't important or isn't a useful test. I scored very well on the SAT. I'm a big fan of it. But I don't believe that because I scored 5 points higher than a friend of mine who scored 5 points lower, that just means for all time that I have more ability than my friend does. Right? So
wouldn't it be best for you to keep trying until you earn the way? And if your scores are lower, the SAT score says that it has to be higher to get in. Why not follow that rule? So if you don't get your score is lower, why not keep trying? Go back and study more and come back and take it again.
But why is the
rather
why
than
do we act
passing
like the SAT?
Rather than passing up the person who has worked hard just to let some black person in there, just to be the quota system.
Two things. One, why do we act like the SAT is particularly important? Right? Like what?
Because
why
it is important. That's the standard.
But why is it the standard? Right? And I think that's a question.
Why do you think it's the standard?
You just said it right? You just said, this person worked harder than you did to get his extra 5 points. That empirically turns out to not necessarily be true. What's more likely to be true is that person A, who got 5 more points, had more money to invest in tutors and SAT prep courses than person B, and that's what explains the 5 points. I used to teach the LSAT, the law school version of this for really well-respected test prep organization, and it was very clear. If you had the money to take my class, you were going to do better. If you didn't have the money to take my class, you were going to score worse on this test, and that has nothing to do with your ability, and has nothing to do with your work effort. It's whether or not you were able to afford the kind of tricks of the trade I was able to teach you. So I think that when you look at the totality of one's experience, placing it all on one Saturday afternoon test that can be gamed by professionals with the money to hire the right tutors, I think that there are other reasons why a college might want to admit people.
Here's what the Michigan Attorney General had to say about affirmative action, and I thought it was right on the money.
In the battle over affirmative action, Michigan is front and center. After the Supreme Court refused in 2003 to end affirmative action programs at the University of Michigan Law School, voters approved Proposition 2, amending the state constitution to prohibit admissions programs that give preferential treatment to or discriminate against people based on their race. Michigan Attorney General Bill Schuette said voters wanted to take race out of decision-making.
It's an expression that in Michigan, we think it's wrong, fundamentally wrong, to treat people differently based on their race or the color of their skin.
Michigan is not alone. 5 other states have similar bans outlawing the use of racial preferences.
I agree with that, Elie. Also, I want to know from you, does it bother you that blacks have a stigma on them now? Because whenever I speak at different universities around the country, or some black tell me that they got into some prestige, quote unquote, prestige school, I automatically think that it's not because they're smart, and it's because they're black and they got in. And that kind of person, even though they may have graduated from that school, is not as qualified as the person who earned their way and graduated.
Right. So that's basically the Clarence Thomas argument here. Clarence Thomas, the black conservative Supreme Court justice, this is the argument that he makes about affirmative action all the time. As a black person who, as you mentioned earlier, I got into Harvard twice, I face that stigma all the time. You'd think that the second time would have shut people up, but no, I still face
when I read last night that you had gotten in twice, I'm just thinking an affirmative action baby, a man who did not earn his way.
And I face that stigma, that belief all the time.
How do you feel about that?
Well, what I feel is that just because and that's very annoying to me, but just because that stigma is annoying to me doesn't mean that the entire program that does give opportunities to people should be thrown out on its ear. If people don't think that I am as qualified as the next Harvard guy just because of my color, let's fight it out.
It's not just because it's not just because of your color. It's because you got in because you were black.
Well, no, people think that I got in because I'm black, but actually I didn't, right? That's just.
But how would we ever know that, though? How would we ever know that?
But see, here's the thing, right? I do know that, right? It's not. People act like it's some kind of big black box mystery. It's really not. I went to a very, kind of preppy New York elitist freaking high school, right? Bunch of people in my class applied to Harvard. Only 3 of us got in. Of the 3, there was a white guy. He was very good at playing the piano. There was a white girl. She was very good at playing field hockey. She was all-state in field hockey. And there was me. I was a black guy. I also had the best standardized test scores of the 3 people who got in. So you can say, I just got in because I'm black, but I'm pretty sure that I just got in because of my standardized test scores.
But see, there's not one person in America who would believe that. That may be true, and it may not be true. But because you got in, because you were black and affirmative action stands in the way, nobody's going to believe that you were qualified. Let me take a quick break. We'll come back and wind this down, wind it up. Back in a moment. Okay, folks, we're talking about affirmative action in some of the schools around the country. And we're discussing Michigan State Constitution Amendment Proposition 2, which was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court 2 weeks ago now, I believe. And this law was passed by the voters of Michigan 58 to 42% back in 2006. It says no affirmative action, no admission into the universities that are based on color, that you got to earn your way. 8 states ban affirmative action: Michigan, Arizona, California, Florida, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Washington have all banned affirmative action based on color. And I think that's a good thing. In many ways, it's wrong to discriminate against someone based on color. And in order to let black people enter into these schools just because they're black, it's discriminated against whites. And that's not fair. Elie Mystal is with me. He's an attorney and a writer. We're going to tell you how to get to his website here in a minute. Elie, have you ever been discriminated against based on color?
In my life?
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Based on color.
Do I have to start doing the cab stories? I mean, like, of course.
And how did you feel about that? When that happened to you, how did that feel?
Bad.
And so can you imagine that white students are feeling the same way? They work very hard from day one to get into some of the final schools around the country. They're now ready to get in, but they can't because some black person is complaining about their color, so they let them in. Can you imagine how those white kids must be feeling and those families?
Yeah, except that empirically, it's not actually white students who are being shut out because of affirmative action. If anything, the people who have a legitimate gripe about affirmative action taking spots away from them are not white students. They're Asian students, and their gripes aren't just with affirmative action. They're with legacies. They're with sports scholarships. If you honestly think that a standardized test is the end-all and be-all of merit, then the top universities in this country should be 50% Asian, based on how they score. And the part of the university that isn't Asian, that is very white, should be almost entirely Jewish, based on how they score. So if we're going to say that, affirmative action is really taking the spots of people, it's not kind of average Joe Schmo white guy who's salt of the earth white dude. It's high-performing Asians and high-performing Jewish kids who score very highly, but it's totally okay for colleges and universities to look at all of these other factors when putting together their class.
Amazing. Here's what liberal professor had to say about this new rule and this new law.
But supporters of affirmative action say Proposal 2 amounts to racial discrimination by rigging the political process against minorities. The Federal Appeals Court agreed and struck down Proposal 2, saying it made it too hard for minorities to change policies that affect them.
What Prop 2 has done is allowed the majority to take away the policy that the university has for hearing everybody's voice. So essentially, the will of the majority has silenced the minority.
Rosie Sabeo and her husband Matthew Countryman are professors at the University of Michigan. They say the ban has cut minority enrollment by a third and had a negative effect in the classroom.
As a group, they feel less a part of things, less able to participate in the give and take of the institution.
Amazing. So what they're saying, two things that they're saying, Elliot, I want you to respond to, is that now that there are fewer blacks in the classes, that the blacks who are left there feel insecure, and that's a reason to have affirmative action based on color. Is that dumb or what?
Yeah, I don't agree with that argument full cloth. But what I will say is this, and just to go back to my own experience, when I went to high school, I was the only black kid in my class, and there are a lot of black people who do that, and fine. But when I went to Harvard, there were lots of other black people in the class, and having those other black people in the class, it at least gave me this much. It at least put me in a situation where if I had an opinion, or if I had a voice, or if I had something to add, I didn't have to feel the burden as if I was speaking for all black people. You know?
But you shouldn't have to feel that anyway. That's one thing that black people need to get over. And not all, but most black people feel for whatever strange reason that they're all one, and if you have one black in an all-white class, somehow or another you're representing the black community. That is holding black people back, and you're not speaking for anyone but yourself.
But I don't think black people feel like that. I think that a lot of times people in the majority feel like that. And so the point of my story is that being in a class where there were multiple black voices, where other black people would disagree with me, I thought made for a much more full, interesting, and rich classroom discussion. And that's one of the last points I want to make about affirmative action. Let's remember here that this is all about public universities and federal programs, right? Private schools like Harvard, like Duke, like Stanford, they can do whatever they want, and they have been able to do whatever they want for as long as they've wanted
right.
to. And consistently, the best universities always try to have a diverse class with lots of whites and blacks and Asians and Jews and everybody, right? And the reason why they do that is because overall, not just for black people, but for white people too, for Latinos too, for Jews too, It makes the educational environment better when you have a diverse group of voices, experiences, and whatnot, and that's what affirmative action does. So even if the Supreme Court knocks down affirmative action in Michigan, which I think they will, and affirmative action is outlawed in public universities in Michigan and public universities across the South and public universities here and there, the top private schools will still practice affirmative action because it benefits not just the black kids that they let in, but it benefits the white kids that they let in too.
How about the fact, and this happened at UCLA and other schools where affirmative action was banned based on color. Once they banned that based on color, enrollment went down for black people, which proves the point that they were never really able to earn their way. They were just there because of their color. And now because they're not academically qualified, they can't get in. So that should speak volumes. So, and as someone said, why not help these folks before they get to that point? Why not, teach them when they in a lower education?
Well, there's also selection bias here, too. I mean, some of the top students who could apply to these schools that have banned affirmative action decide not to because they don't want to go to a school that doesn't have a diverse student body, right? So when UCLA bans affirmative action, when Michigan bans affirmative action, you don't just lose so-called underperforming black students. You also lose high-performing black students who would rather go to Duke, who would rather go to Yale, who would rather go to some other institution that promises a more diverse experience.
But that would be fine. That would be fine with me, and I think most Americans, because if these black folks are so into their color, they got to go to school where they're so-called mixed everybody, then I wouldn't want them at my school anyway, because it implies that they're racist from the beginning, and we don't need that.
I think all I would say constitutionally is that if you were running an institution, you are free to make that determination. Why shouldn't an institution be free to make a different determination? Why should they be legally barred from doing things differently? That's what the Michigan law does. It prevents a great school like Michigan University from practicing the admissions practices that it has decided makes for the best educational environment for all of their students.
Let me take a short break. I'll come back and let you give your information out, and we'll be done. Back in a moment. Okay, my final segment with Elie, and he was scheduled for 30 minutes, and we're talking about this Proposition 2, which would get rid of affirmative action in Michigan based on race. Elie Mystal is editor of Above the Law, and he is in support of affirmative action based on color for university. Elie, what is your website? I want the folks to read your writings.
Oh, it's abovethelaw.com. We do a lot of industry news. We also try to take, I do more columns on kind of the things of the day. And even though I am generally liberal, it's not just for liberals. I think the last thing I wrote was actually a pretty biting article against the nanny state and bullying laws in Texas.
Okay. Can you take a few calls?
Yeah, but I can.
Yeah, I know. We'll just finish this up, and I know you have to run. I appreciate you taking them. Let's go out to Los Angeles first and talk to the Bible Go-To Guy. Bible Go-To Guy, welcome to the show, sir.
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to make a comment to your guest. Sir, their diversity is a total straw man. And what I mean by that is, when you go into a university, you're looking for the smartest people to be around. And you don't care that they know how to dance well or that somehow they have a different sociological experience. That means nothing when it comes to trying to solve real questions of science and math. Now, maybe if you're in some dance class, it'd be good to have, a little mix of people. But when it comes to real college, which is science and math, you just, with the smartest people is what matters. Do you think the Chinese are worried about diversity? Do you think the Japanese are worried about diversity? The Germans? They're all manufacturing giants, and they aren't going out. They aren't coming to the U.S. or to Africa to look for Africans or to look for Chinese or something to be in their class for diversity because somehow that's some magic thing that's going to help the class. It doesn't help at all.
Let's get a reaction. Elie?
Yeah, you know what? I'll give you that diversity does not help you figure out the technical skills necessary to make an iPhone. But what diversity does help with is coming up with the creativity to even conceive of an iPhone, to bring it to market, and to make money off the iPhone. So when you look at some of these other countries...
No, that's not true.
I'm saying that being educated in an environment where people have different ideas and different experiences, and they all throw those experiences into the mix, yeah, it does help you do some more creative things, and that is the lesson that China is actually trying to learn right now.
Well, what does creativity have to do with race?
I'm saying that bringing people together from different experiences helps creativity. You don't have to just do it on race, by the way. I mean, like I've been accepting your definition of the term, right? But you don't have to just do affirmative action based on race. You can do it based on economic background. You can do it based on the totality of a person's experiences. I think that actually one of the ways that affirmative action kind of hasn't gotten to where it needs to go is because too many schools, I would say generally the worst schools, but too many schools try to do it just based on race this, race that, as opposed to really looking at person's experience.
Sir, the Asians, and none of them are diverse. All, you go to South Korea where Samsung is, and you go to Japan where Sony is. You don't have any diversity there, and they're coming up with all kinds of good ideas.
If you go to Japan, you bring in kids from Osaka, you bring in kids from Tokyo, you bring in kids from Kyoto, you bring in kids from the fishing village. That's diverse. Just because they all happen to they all happen to look the same color to us doesn't mean that they're not diverse amongst themselves.
Thank you, Bob. Good to God. I appreciate that. Let's go out to Virginia and talk to Curtis. Curtis, welcome to the show. You're on with Elie.
In my mind, diversity is another way of black folks segregating themselves. Once they have a bunch of black folks in an institution, they always segregate themselves, and they don't mix with the community.
That's a good point. That's a good point. How do you respond to that, Elie?
That just absolutely hasn't been my experience. I find that I don't know how else to respond to that. I mean, maybe some places they do, not where I grew up and not how I rolled.
And let me share this with you. Let me share this also. I used to work with a Muslim woman. Her daughter went to University of Virginia. And one of the things this woman said that University of Virginia wasn't diverse enough. What she really was saying, they didn't have enough Muslims there for her daughter to hang out with. Well, her daughter ended up marrying a black guy who wasn't a Muslim. So that's what diversity means, segregating yourself.
That's a very good point. Thank you, Curtis.
I think people who go to an institution of higher learning, go to college, the best 4 years of your life, and all you're going to do is talk to people who look just like you and think just like you. I think that the people who do that are hurting their own self.
But that is what happens most of the time. Let's go out to Delaware real fast and squeeze in Greg. Greg, you're on with Elie. Thanks for calling.
Hey, good morning. When I was a kid, I used to get teased all the time about having a big nose. And imagine, and since then I've almost forgotten that even happened. And my nose hasn't gotten any smaller as I've gotten older. But imagine there was a group of people with big noses, and you had to get a preference for big noses, and you couldn't discriminate against people with big noses. I would be all hung up about being a big-nosed person. And that, I think, is my point, or what I would like to assert relative to the, quote, black thing. It's just another characteristic. Why get all hung up about it?
Elie?
400 years of segregation and slavery? I mean, I think that reducing the entire black experience in America to a big nose facial feature is wholly missing the point. I think it's wholly missing the point, right?
That whole slavery thing is over. Drop it and get on with life. Just like
I dropped people teasing. The whole slavery thing is over, so people should drop it and move on.
But you don't agree, Elie, that it is over, except in the minds of racist black people?
I don't know. I don't understand. I honestly don't understand what the definition here. Of course, it is a historical thing, just like the Holocaust is a historical thing, or the taking of the land from the Native Americans is a historical thing. It's not a current situation, but the effects of that historical thing still linger on, and it's not just kind of it's not just people being.
But you don't see the Jews crying. You don't see the Jews crying about it. They're out there working hard and succeeding. They're not asking for color. They're not asking for color preference.
They remember their history. It is through remembering their history that Jews have been able to I think, remain such a success story in America.
Elie, thank you so much for being with me, buddy. I'll have you back.
Thank you very much for having me on.
All right. Back in a moment.